The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum opened in January 1855 on a 140-acre plot approximately 2 miles north of Jackson, Mississippi. The facility was conceived under legislation passed in 1848, following advocacy by Dorothea Dix, whose national campaign promoted the establishment of state-funded institutions for the care of individuals classified as insane. The asylum's construction followed the Kirkbride Plan, an architectural and operational model developed by Thomas Story Kirkbride and endorsed by the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. The Kirkbride design emphasized moral treatment, a therapeutic philosophy grounded in the belief that mental illness could be ameliorated through structured routines, humane living conditions, and exposure to restorative environments. The physical layout reflected this philosophy. A central administrative building was flanked by linear wings that extended outward and backward, creating separate wards for male and female patients. Each ward was designed to house patients in hierarchical classification, acute cases nearest the center, chronic cases progressively farther from administrative oversight. The building was 4 stories tall, constructed of brick with a slate roof, and surmounted by a cupola that functioned both as architectural ornamentation and as a ventilation mechanism. Large windows along the ward corridors were intended to maximize natural light and air circulation. The surrounding grounds included cultivated gardens, walkways, and open fields, all intended to provide therapeutic benefit through exposure to pastoral scenery. The asylum was designed to accommodate between 250 and 300 patients. Initial admissions were governed by a legal framework in which commitment required a petition to the probate court, testimony before a jury, and a majority verdict affirming insanity. Patients could be committed by family members, or in cases where family declined or was absent, by county authorities acting on complaints from any citizen. Once committed, the cost of care was charged either to the patient's estate, if assets were available, or to the county of residence. The financial structure created an incentive for counties to limit the number of indigent commitments, but it also provided a mechanism by which families or communities could permanently remove individuals deemed socially or economically burdensome. The legal threshold for commitment was deliberately low. Diagnoses were broad and subjective. Chronic mania, acute melancholia, hysteria, epilepsy, and feeble-mindedness were all sufficient grounds for indefinite institutionalization. Predisposing causes recorded in admission registers included heredity, intemperance, religious excitement, grief, financial worry, and for women, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. These categories reflected prevailing psychiatric theory, which attributed mental illness to moral weakness, constitutional defect, or exposure to destabilizing modern influences. The diagnostic framework was not designed to identify discrete, treatable conditions. It was designed to classify individuals who deviated from normative behavior and to justify their removal from society. The asylum's operational premise rested on several core assumptions. First, that confinement in a structured, controlled environment was inherently therapeutic. Patients were expected to benefit from regular schedules, adequate nutrition, manual labor, and removal from the chaotic or immoral environments believed to have precipitated their conditions. Second, that the majority of patients were incurable. The term chronic appeared frequently in asylum records and reflected a fatalistic understanding of mental illness as a permanent degenerative condition. Acute cases, defined as those whose symptoms appeared suddenly and without prior history, were considered potentially recoverable. Chronic cases, particularly those involving long-standing behavioral disturbances, intellectual disability, or severe physical debility, were expected to remain institutionalized for life. Third, that segregation by race and gender was medically and socially necessary. The asylum operated under Mississippi's racial caste system. White and black patients were housed in separate wards, attended by separate staff, and subjected to different standards of care. Gender segregation was similarly rigid, reflecting contemporary beliefs about the distinct nature of male and female insanity. The therapeutic model relied heavily on labor. Patients who were physically capable were assigned tasks on the asylum farm, in the laundry, kitchen, bakery, carpenter shop, or sewing room. Labor was framed as occupational therapy, a means of imposing structure and purpose on disordered minds. In practice, it functioned as unpaid institutional maintenance. The asylum operated as a largely self-sustaining enterprise. Patients grew vegetables, raised livestock, manufactured clothing and furniture, and performed the domestic and mechanical work required to keep the facility operational. The economic logic was straightforward. State appropriations were chronically insufficient. The institution depended on patient labor to bridge the gap between allocated funds and operational costs. Patients who could not work, either due to physical incapacity, severe cognitive impairment, or violent behavior, were confined to wards with minimal supervision and little therapeutic intervention. The assumption that labor was therapeutic masked a deeper structural contradiction. Patients who performed essential work were indispensable to the institution's functioning, yet their productivity did not translate into improved conditions or accelerated discharge. Length of stay was not determined by clinical improvement, but by legal and administrative inertia. Discharge required a formal petition, medical certification, and in many cases, proof of family willingness to resume custody. For indigent patients, particularly those committed by county authorities rather than family, the procedural obstacles to release were nearly insurmountable. Chronic patients became permanent residents by default. The asylum's design capacity of 250 to 300 patients was exceeded within the first decade of operation. By 1891, the population had reached 471. By 1907, it exceeded 1,100. By the time of the institution's relocation in 1935, more than 2,500 patients were confined within a facility originally designed for fewer than 300. Overcrowding fundamentally altered the conditions under which care was delivered. Wards designed for 40 patients housed 80 or more. Beds were placed in hallways, day rooms, and storage areas. Patients slept on floors. Ventilation systems designed for a smaller population proved inadequate. Infectious disease spread rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated wards. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and pellagra became endemic. Mortality rates rose accordingly. Between 1855 and 1877, more than 1 in 5 admitted patients died within the institution. During the 1920s, tuberculosis and pellagra epidemics produced mortality spikes that superintendents attributed to overcrowding and inadequate funding, but did not characterize as preventable failures of care. The biennial report submitted to the state legislature consistently requested increased appropriations, additional buildings, and more staff. These requests were rarely fulfilled. The gap between the institution's stated therapeutic mission and its actual capacity to provide care widened continuously. The asylum's information architecture, the system by which patient status was recorded and communicated, was minimal. Admission registers documented name, age, county of origin, occupation, diagnosis, and date of entry. Discharge records noted whether the patient was released, transferred, died, or in some cases, eloped. The register did not track treatment, behavioral observations, or clinical progress. It functioned primarily as an administrative ledger. Superintendents submitted biennial reports to the state legislature summarizing admissions, discharges, deaths, and operational expenses. These reports provided aggregate statistics, but included no individual patient narratives. The asylum's internal record-keeping was similarly sparse. Ward attendants maintained daily logs noting incidents of violence, self-harm, or illness, but these logs were not systematically compiled or analyzed. The result was an institution in which thousands of individuals lived, worked, and died, yet left behind almost no detailed documentation of their experiences, symptoms, or trajectories. The absence of records was not an oversight, it was a structural feature of an institution designed to warehouse rather than treat. The cemetery was established shortly after the asylum opened. Patients who died without family able or willing to claim their remains were buried on site. The practice was common among 19th-century asylums and reflected both logistical necessity and the social marginalization of the institutionalized. The cemetery occupied a section of the asylum grounds away from the main buildings. Burials were conducted without coffin markers. A central register recorded the names of the deceased, their date of death, and in some cases, the cause of death. But this register was not comprehensive. Many deaths, particularly in the pre-1912 period before Mississippi began issuing death certificates, went unrecorded or were documented only in summary form in biennial reports. The cemetery grew incrementally, parallel to the institution's expanding population and rising mortality rate. By the time the asylum relocated in 1935, thousands of individuals had been interred in unmarked graves. The cemetery remained on the original campus, which was subsequently sold and redeveloped. The graves were not moved, they were not memorialized. They were forgotten. The design premise that structured every aspect of the asylum's operation, from architecture to admission procedures to labor assignments, contained embedded vulnerabilities that would ensure systemic failure. The assumption that confinement was therapeutic required adequate resources, trained staff, and clinical oversight. None of these conditions were met. The assumption that labor was rehabilitative required that patients retain agency and dignity. Instead, labor functioned as economic exploitation. The assumption that segregation by race and gender was medically justified codified structural inequality that resulted in demonstrably worse outcomes for Black patients. The assumption that chronic patients were incurable created a self-fulfilling prophecy in which individuals labeled incurable received no treatment and were therefore never cured. The asylum operated as designed. It removed individuals from society, confined them in a controlled environment, extracted labor from their bodies, and buried them in unmarked graves when they died. The cemetery is not evidence of malfunction. It is evidence that the system performed exactly as its design assumptions dictated it would. The vulnerabilities embedded in the asylum's design did not operate in isolation. They were amplified by a series of latent conditions, organizational structures, and procedural norms that created predictable pathways toward failure. These conditions were present from the institution's earliest years, but their effects compounded as the patient population grew and resources failed to keep pace. The system did not degrade suddenly. It eroded incrementally through accumulation of small compromises, deferred maintenance, and normalization of substandard conditions. By the time external observers characterized the asylum as a site of systemic neglect, the institution had been operating under those conditions for decades. The first latent condition was the chronic insufficiency of state funding. Mississippi was among the poorest states in the nation throughout the asylum's operational period. State appropriations for public institutions were limited, and mental health care ranked low among competing priorities. The asylum's budget was determined biennially by the legislature based on superintendent requests and fiscal constraints. Superintendents consistently requested funding increases to accommodate rising patient populations, construct additional buildings, hire more staff, and improve sanitation and medical care. These requests were rarely approved in full. The result was an institution that operated in a state of permanent resource scarcity. Per capita daily expenditures for patient care declined in real terms over the institution's history. In 1936, following the relocation to the new facility at Whitfield, the daily expenditure per patient was reported as 42 cents. By 1946, it had risen to 59 cents, still far below the minimum necessary to provide adequate nutrition, medical care, and staffing. Food budgets were particularly constrained. Patients subsisted on diets heavy in cornmeal, molasses, and cheap starches, with minimal protein or fresh vegetables. Nutritional deficiencies, particularly pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency, became epidemic within the asylum population during the early 20th century. Pellagra presented with dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and, if untreated, death. The disease was preventable through dietary modification, but the asylum's food budget did not permit the purchase of niacin-rich foods in sufficient quantities. Superintendents acknowledged the dietary origin of pellagra in biennial reports, but framed it as an unavoidable consequence of funding limitations, rather than a preventable failure of care. The second latent condition was the inadequacy of staffing, both in number and training. The asylum employed attendants to supervise patients, perform custodial tasks, and enforce institutional rules. Attendants were not required to have medical training or psychiatric expertise. Many were hired based on physical strength and willingness to work for low wages. Salaries for attendants ranged from $60 to $75 per month during the 1940s, a rate insufficient to attract or retain qualified personnel. Turnover was high. Attendants who remained in the position for extended periods often did so because alternative employment was unavailable, not because they were suited to the work. The ratio of attendants to patients was chronically inadequate. During periods of peak overcrowding in the 1920s and 1930s, a single attendant might be responsible for supervising 60 or more patients on a ward. Under such conditions, individual patient observation and therapeutic intervention were functionally impossible. Attendants focused on maintaining order, preventing escapes, and responding to emergencies. Violent or disruptive patients were restrained using mechanical devices, confined to isolation rooms, or subjected to punitive measures framed as necessary for institutional security. The use of restraints was justified as protecting patients from harming themselves or others, but, in practice, restraints functioned as a labor-saving device, a means of managing unruly patients without sufficient staffing to provide one-on-one supervision. The third latent condition was the segregation of facilities and unequal allocation of resources by race. Mississippi law mandated racial segregation in all public institutions. The asylum maintained separate wards for white and black patients, with separate staff, separate dining facilities, and separate recreational spaces. Segregation was presented as medically necessary, reflecting racist pseudoscientific beliefs that black and white patients required different forms of care. In practice, segregation ensured that black patients received systematically inferior treatment. Biennial reports from the 1920s explicitly acknowledged that wards housing black patients were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, inadequately heated, and located in the least desirable sections of the facility. The 1925 to 1927 biennial report noted that black patients were confined to wards that had been designed to house 60 individuals but contained double that number. The report attributed disproportionately high mortality rates among black patients to these conditions, but concluded that nothing could be done until the new facility at Whitfield was completed. The same report admitted that black patients were denied access to the asylum grounds and outdoor exercise because allowing them such access would require white patients to share the space, a scenario the superintendent deemed unacceptable. The superintendent wrote that black patients were denied the liberties and freedom, an outside exercise to which they are entitled, and which would greatly aid and hasten their recovery. The statement is remarkable for its explicit acknowledgement that institutional policy deliberately deprived black patients of therapeutic interventions available to white patients. The superintendent did not characterize this as unethical. He framed it as an unavoidable consequence of segregation. The fourth latent condition was the asylum's dependence on patient labor. The institution required patients to perform the work necessary to sustain its operations. Patients farmed, cooked, laundered, sewed, built furniture, maintained buildings, and cared for livestock. This labor was classified as occupational therapy and framed as beneficial to patients' mental health. The therapeutic justification obscured the economic reality. The asylum could not function without unpaid patient labor. Patients who refused to work, or who were unable to work due to physical or cognitive impairment, were relegated to custodial wards where they received minimal care and no therapeutic intervention. Patients who worked productively were essential to the institution, but were not rewarded with improved conditions, accelerated discharge, or any form of compensation. The system created a perverse incentive structure in which the asylum had a financial interest in retaining capable workers. Discharge required a formal process involving medical certification and family or county willingness to assume custody. For patients whose labor was valuable, there was no institutional pressure to expedite discharge. The longer they remained, the more the institution benefited. The fifth latent condition was the inadequacy of medical oversight. The asylum employed physicians, but their numbers were insufficient relative to the patient population. During the 1920s, a single physician might be responsible for overseeing several hundred patients. Ward rounds were cursory. Treatment options were limited. Sedatives, hydrotherapy, and mechanical restraints were the primary interventions. Newer treatments, such as insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy, were introduced in the 1930s but were applied without rigorous clinical protocols or informed consent procedures. Lobotomies, a a surgical procedure involving the severing of neural connections in the prefrontal cortex, were developed in the late 1930s and promoted as a treatment for severe, treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions. There is no documentary evidence that lobotomies were performed at the Mississippi State Asylum prior to its relocation, but the procedure was widely adopted at other Southern institutions during the 1940s and 1950s. Medical experimentation was common in psychiatric asylums during this period, driven by a combination of therapeutic optimism and the perception that institutionalized patients were appropriate subjects for unproven interventions. Patients had no legal right to refuse treatment. Consent was obtained from families or legal guardians, if obtained at all. The power imbalance between physicians and patients, compounded by patients' legal incapacity and social marginalization, created conditions under which coercive and harmful treatments could be administered without accountability. The sixth latent condition was the normalization of high mortality rates. Asylum superintendents reported patient deaths in biennial reports, often with minimal explanation. Causes of death included tuberculosis, pellagra, dysentery, pneumonia, heart disease, and exhaustion. Some deaths were attributed to accidents or suicide. The reports framed mortality as an unfortunate but expected outcome given the chronic and incurable nature of many patients' conditions. Comparisons to mortality rates in other institutions or the general population were rare. When comparisons were made, they were used to argue that the Mississippi Asylum's mortality rate was not unusually high, a defensive posture that implicitly acknowledged the expectation of scrutiny. During epidemic periods, such as the pellagra outbreaks of the 1920s, superintendents attributed deaths to factors beyond institutional control, such as patients' pre-existing malnutrition prior to admission. This framing deflected responsibility and reinforced the narrative that the asylum was doing the best it could under difficult circumstances. The reality was that many deaths were preventable. Pellagra could have been prevented through dietary improvement. Tuberculosis transmission could have been reduced through better ventilation, less overcrowding, and isolation of infectious patients. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections could have been minimized through improved sanitation and access to clean water. The institution possessed the knowledge necessary to prevent these deaths, but lacked the resources, and perhaps the will, to implement preventive measures. The seventh latent condition was the procedural structure governing discharge. Patients could not leave the asylum of their own volition. Discharge required either a formal petition demonstrating recovery, a transfer to another institution, or the intervention of family or county authorities willing to assume custody. For chronic patients, particularly those without family or financial resources, the procedural barriers to discharge were insurmountable. Patients classified as incurable were not considered candidates for discharge. Patients who exhibited behavioral problems, even if their underlying mental illness had stabilized, were deemed too dangerous to release. Patients who had been institutionalized for extended periods, particularly those who had lost contact with family or community ties, had nowhere to go even if discharge were approved. The result was an institutional population composed largely of individuals who had become permanent residents not because they required ongoing psychiatric treatment, but because the system provided no pathway out. The asylum functioned in effect as a warehouse for individuals society no longer wished to accommodate. The eighth latent condition was the absence of external oversight. The asylum operated under the authority of a board of trustees appointed by the governor. The board met periodically to review financial reports and approve major expenditures, but conducted no systematic evaluation of clinical practices, patient outcomes, or conditions of confinement. State inspections were infrequent and superficial. Media coverage was limited and typically favorable, emphasizing the asylum's role as a charitable institution serving the state's most vulnerable citizens. Investigative journalism exposing abuse or neglect was rare. When abuses were reported, such as allegations of patient beatings in the 1940s, investigations were conducted by legislative committees with limited medical expertise and a vested interest in avoiding scandal. Institutional culture reinforced the perception that harsh conditions and strict discipline were necessary to manage dangerous or uncooperative patients. Attendants who used excessive force or neglected patient care faced little risk of accountability unless their actions resulted in visible injury or death. Even then, dismissals were more common than criminal prosecutions. The institutional environment shielded misconduct and discouraged whistleblowing. The cumulative effect of these latent conditions was a system in which failure was not only possible but structurally inevitable. Chronic underfunding ensured that resources would never match the needs of the population. Inadequate staffing ensured that patients would not receive individualized care or supervision. Racial segregation ensured that Black patients would suffer disproportionately. Dependence on patient labor ensured that economic considerations would override therapeutic goals. Weak medical oversight ensured that harmful or experimental treatments would be applied without rigorous evaluation. Normalization of high mortality rates ensured that preventable deaths would be attributed to patient pathology rather than institutional failure. Procedural barriers to discharge ensured that patients would remain institutionalized long after any therapeutic justification had expired. Absence of external oversight ensured that abuses would go unreported and unaddressed. These conditions did not cause specific incidents of harm. They created an environment in which harm was continuous, diffuse, and invisible to external observers. The cemetery did not fill suddenly. It filled incrementally, one unmarked grave at a time, over the course of 80 years. The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum did not experience a single catastrophic initiating event that precipitated systemic collapse. There was no explosion, no flood, no fire that suddenly exposed the institution's failures. Instead, the initiating event was continuous and diffuse, the relentless admission of patients into a facility that had exceeded its design capacity within the first decade of operation and never ceased growing. The divergence between the asylum's stated mission and its operational reality began at the moment the first patient was admitted and widened incrementally with each subsequent commitment. By the early 20th century, the gap between the institution's therapeutic premise and its actual function had become unbridgeable. The asylum was no longer a hospital in any meaningful sense. It was a detention facility for individuals society had classified as unmarriageable, unemployable, or otherwise socially undesirable. The admission process itself was the mechanism through which this divergence was initiated and sustained. Commitment to the asylum required a petition to the probate court, testimony before a jury, and a majority verdict affirming insanity. The legal standard was deliberately vague. Insanity was not defined by specific diagnostic criteria, but by deviation from normative behavior. Petitions cited a wide range of justifications: religious fanaticism, sexual promiscuity, refusal to work, chronic insubordination, habitual drunkenness, and for women, unmarried pregnancy or resistance to marriage. Medical testimony was rarely required. In Mississippi and Kentucky, juries rather than physicians determined whether an individual met the threshold for commitment. This procedural structure allowed families and communities to use the asylum as a mechanism for removing burdensome or disruptive individuals without needing to demonstrate that those individuals posed a danger to themselves or others. The threshold for commitment was far lower than the threshold for discharge. Once admitted, patients could not leave without formal approval. The legal presumption shifted. Inside the asylum, the burden of proof rested with the patient to demonstrate sanity, competence, and the existence of a family or community willing to resume custody. For indigent patients, for patients estranged from family, and for patients whose symptoms were chronic rather than acute, this burden was insurmountable. The first documented patient, admitted on January 10, 1855, was identified in asylum records only as E. By 1870, this individual was still confined within the institution, described in the superintendent's synoptical history as sinking into hopeless dementia. No recovery was expected. No discharge was anticipated. The case was framed as evidence of the asylum's charitable commitment to lifelong care for the incurable. This framing established the institutional norm. Chronic patients were expected to remain until death. The asylum's original design capacity was 250 to 300 patients. By 1891, the population had reached 471. By 1907, it exceeded 1,100. By 1925, the population approached 2,000. By the time of the relocation to Whitfield in 1935, more than 2,500 patients were confined within the facility. The physical infrastructure did not expand proportionally. Wards designed to house 40 patients contained 80 or more. Hallways, day rooms, and storage areas were converted into sleeping quarters. Beds were placed side by side with minimal clearance. Patients slept on floors. The overcrowding was not a temporary crisis, it was the institution's permanent operational condition. The admission registers provide a granular record of who was committed and why. A sample of 15 patients admitted between 1900 and 1930 and who died prior to the asylum's relocation reveals consistent patterns. Most were committed in their 20s or 30s. Most were diagnosed with chronic mania, acute mania, chronic melancholia, or dementia. Most were farmers or housewives. Predisposing causes included heredity, ill health, and unknown factors. Exciting causes included grief, menopause, childbirth, financial trouble, and religious excitement. Length of stay ranged from a few months to more than 20 years. Approximately 2/3 of sampled patients died within the institution. Causes of death included tuberculosis, pellagra, exhaustion, epilepsy, and diseases of the digestive or circulatory systems. The records are incomplete. Many entries lack dates of discharge, cause of death, or even confirmation of whether the patient was released or died. The cemetery database compiled by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History lists 4,380 deaths between 1912, when the state began issuing death certificates, and 1935. Prior to 1912, death records are fragmentary or non-existent. Estimates of total deaths during the asylum's 80-year history range from 7,000 to over 10,000. The true figure is unknowable. The records were not designed to preserve individual patient trajectories. They were designed to track administrative transactions, admission, discharge, death. The racial composition of the cemetery population diverges sharply from the institution's overall demographics. Approximately 75% of burials analyzed to date are identified as African American, despite Black patients constituting roughly 50 to 55% of the total patient population during the 1920s and 1930s. This disparity reflects differential mortality rates driven by the latent conditions described in the previous chapter. Black patients were confined to overcrowded, poorly ventilated wards. They were denied access to outdoor exercise and therapeutic labor assignments available to white patients. They received less medical attention. Biennial reports from the 1920s explicitly attributed higher mortality among Black patients to inferior living conditions but framed these conditions as unavoidable pending construction of new facilities. The 1925 to 1927 report stated that wards housing Black patients, designed for 60 individuals, contained 120. The report noted that these wards were dark and dreary and poorly ventilated and terribly overcrowded, and it is impossible to make them habitable. The superintendent estimated that 250 Black patient deaths could have been prevented if the new facility had been completed sooner. This statement constitutes documentary acknowledgement that deaths were preventable and that institutional policy decisions, specifically the prioritization of white patient facilities over Black patient facilities, directly contributed to excess mortality. The superintendent did not characterize this as a failure of duty. He presented it as a resource allocation problem, pending legislative appropriation. The pellagra epidemic of the 1920s illustrates how the divergence between institutional rhetoric and reality produced mass mortality. Pellagra is caused by niacin deficiency in presence with dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. The disease was well understood by the 1922. Its dietary origin had been conclusively demonstrated by epidemiological studies conducted by the United States Public Health Service. Prevention required increasing dietary intake of niacin through consumption of meat, fish, eggs, legumes, or fortified grains. The asylum's food budget did not permit such dietary modification. Patients subsisted on cornmeal, molasses, and cheap starches. Pellagra became endemic. The 1925 to 1927 biennial report noted an unusually high number of pellagrans, predominantly Black patients from flooded regions of the state, admitted during the spring. The report predicted that most would die. The prediction was accurate. Mortality spiked. The superintendent attributed the deaths to pre-existing malnutrition prior to admission and to the inherent severity of pellagra as a disease. He did not acknowledge that the asylum's inadequate diet perpetuated and worsened the condition. Patients admitted with mild pellagra deteriorated and died within the institution because the institution could not or would not provide the nutritional intervention necessary to reverse the disease. The deaths were preventable. They were predicted. They were not prevented. Tuberculosis followed a similar pattern. The disease is transmitted through airborne droplets and thrives in crowded, poorly ventilated environments. The asylum's overcrowded wards provided ideal conditions for tuberculosis transmission. Patients with active tuberculosis were not consistently isolated. Ventilation was inadequate. Patients slept in close proximity. The disease spread rapidly. Biennial reports documented tuberculosis as a leading cause of death, but attributed it to patients' pre-existing susceptibility or the chronic nature of the disease. The role of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and inadequate isolation procedures in facilitating transmission was acknowledged but not framed as a correctable institutional failure. Instead, superintendents requested funding for a separate tuberculosis ward. The request was not approved. Patients with tuberculosis continued to be housed alongside patients without the disease. Transmission continued. Mortality continued. The cemetery filled. The asylum's record-keeping system created a second form of divergence between documented patient status and actual patient outcomes. Admission registers recorded name, diagnosis, date of admission, and in some cases, date and cause of death. They did not track treatment, behavioral observations, or clinical progress. Patients could live within the institution for decades and leave behind only a single line in a ledger. The biennial reports submitted to the state legislature summarized aggregate statistics but provided no individual case narratives. Patients who died were listed by number. So many deaths from tuberculosis, so many from pellagra, so many from exhaustion. The individual circumstances of each death were not recorded. The cemetery register, maintained separately, was even less comprehensive. Many burials were recorded only as unknown or with incomplete names. The cross-referencing of admission registers, death certificates, and cemetery records is incomplete and inconsistent. A patient might appear in the admission register, disappear from the death certificate database, and fail to appear in the cemetery register, leaving no clear indication of whether they were discharged, transferred, or buried in an unmarked grave. The archival gaps are not incidental. They are structural. The institution did not invest in systems for tracking individual patient trajectories because it did not conceive of patients as individuals with recoverable identities. Patients were classified, managed, and when they died, buried. The cemetery reflects this administrative logic. Bodies were interred without markers because markers would have required the institution to maintain permanent individual identification. The absence of markers ensured that once a patient died, they could not be recovered either physically or archivally. The divergence between the asylum's self-presentation and its operational reality was most visible during periods of external scrutiny. In 1949, journalist Hodding Carter published a 3-part investigative series in the Delta Democrat Times exposing conditions at the new facility at Whitfield, which had inherited the patient population, institutional culture, and resource constraints of the Jackson Asylum. Carter documented overcrowding, malnutrition, inadequate staffing, and routine use of mechanical restraints and physical punishment. He compared patient diets to those of concentration camp inmates, noting caloric intake below 1,000 calories per day. He reported allegations of beatings with rubber hoses, denial of toilet paper, and rationing of baths to once per week. He quoted former patients describing conditions of murderous neglect. The asylum's administration responded by disputing specific factual claims, but did not deny that conditions were substandard. Instead, officials argued that the institution was doing the best it could with limited resources and that critics failed to appreciate the difficulty of managing violent or uncooperative patients. This defensive posture mirrored the rhetorical strategy employed in biennial reports throughout the asylum's history. Problems were acknowledged, but attributed to factors beyond institutional control. insufficient legislative appropriations, the inherent difficulty of treating chronic mental illness, and the necessity of maintaining order and security in a custodial environment. The patient narratives that survive challenge the institution's self-presentation. Ada Leah Wynne was admitted on May 11, 1893, 3 weeks after her mother's death. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and living in the family home in Tate County. Her younger brother, Benjamin Wynne, petitioned for her commitment on grounds of chronic dementia, which he claimed had first appeared in 1881. Ada was literate. She could read, write, and speak English. She was classified as a spinster. Family lore attributed her condition to a fall from a baby carriage in childhood, but no medical documentation supports this explanation. Ada died on August 21 or 22, 1906, 13 years after her admission. The cause of death was recorded as consumption, a colloquial term for tuberculosis. She was buried in the Asylum cemetery. Her grave is one of 30 marked with a headstone, a rare exception in a cemetery where the vast majority of burials are unmarked. The headstone was likely purchased by her family. The inscription, added in 1998 during a memorialization effort, reads, "May you rest here in harmony with the universe and in the dignity and peace intended by your Creator." Ada's case illustrates the procedural ease with which families could commit relatives and the difficulty with which those relatives could secure release. She was admitted shortly after a destabilizing life event, the death of her mother. She was committed by a male family member who may have viewed her continued presence in the household as burdensome. She remained institutionalized until her death from a preventable infectious disease. Her family's decision to mark her grave suggests some degree of ongoing connection, but they did not retrieve her body for burial in the family plot. She remained in the Asylum cemetery, her name preserved only because her family purchased a headstone. Isham C. Ernest was admitted sometime before 1858, the first year for which patient registers are available. He does not appear in those registers, suggesting he was among the asylum's earliest admissions. Family lore attributes his insanity to chemical exposure during his work as a hat maker, a plausible hypothesis, given the use of mercury in hat manufacturing during the 19th century. He may also have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder following service in the War of 1812. He lived with his daughter and son-in-law in Neshoba County prior to his commitment. He died within the asylum and was buried in the cemetery. His grave is unmarked. His descendants have been unable to locate definitive records of his admission, diagnosis, or death. His name survives in family genealogical records but not in the asylum's archival holdings. He is representative of the thousands of patients admitted prior to 1912 whose deaths were not recorded in state-issued death certificates and whose burials were not systematically documented. He entered the institution and disappeared. The initiating event was not a single catastrophic failure. It was the normal operation of a system designed to remove individuals from society and confine them indefinitely in conditions that made death a predictable outcome. The divergence between the asylum's therapeutic rhetoric and its custodial reality was present from the beginning and widened continuously. Patients were admitted under the premise that they would receive care. They were confined under conditions that made recovery unlikely and death probable. The cemetery grew because the system functioned as designed. The failure chain within the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum was not mechanical but biological, social, and administrative. It did not unfold over hours or days, as in an industrial accident, but over decades, through the accumulation of untreated disease, malnutrition, environmental exposure, and structural neglect. The physics of failure in this system involve the interaction between human physiology and the conditions of confinement. Patients entered the asylum with baseline health status determined by their prior living conditions, genetic predispositions, and any pre-existing illnesses. Once inside, their trajectories were shaped by the institution's capacity to provide adequate nutrition, sanitation, medical care, and protection from infectious disease. When the institution failed to meet these needs, patient health deteriorated predictably. The failure was not random. It followed pathways determined by the latent conditions and resource constraints already in place. The most significant failure mechanism was malnutrition, particularly the epidemic of pellagra that ravaged the asylum population during the 1920s. Pellagra is caused by insufficient dietary intake of niacin, also known as vitamin B3. The disease presents in 4 stages. Initial symptoms include fatigue, irritability, and gastrointestinal distress. As the deficiency worsens, patients develop dermatitis, characterized by symmetrical scaly lesions on sun-exposed skin, particularly the hands, feet, neck, and face. The skin lesions become hyperpigmented, thickened, and in severe cases, ulcerated. The second major symptom complex involves the gastrointestinal system, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. The third involves the nervous system, dementia, confusion, memory loss, hallucinations, and in terminal cases, stupor and coma. If untreated, pellagra is fatal. The disease was endemic in the southern United States during the early 20th century, particularly among impoverished populations whose diets consisted predominantly of corn-based staples lacking sufficient niacin. The asylum's patient population was drawn disproportionately from these same impoverished communities, meaning many patients entered the institution with pre-existing nutritional deficiencies. The asylum's diet, constrained by inadequate appropriations, perpetuated and worsened these deficiencies. The biennial report for 1925 to 1927 documented the pellagra epidemic explicitly. The superintendent noted that the spring of 1926 brought an unusually high number of admissions diagnosed with pellagra, many of them black patients from flood-affected regions of the Mississippi Delta. The report stated that most of these patients would die, and mortality data confirm this prediction. The 1927 to 1929 report repeated the same pattern, noting continued high mortality from pellagra and attributing it to patients' pre-existing malnutrition. The superintendent's framing obscured the institution's role in perpetuating the disease. Patients admitted with mild pellagra, if provided a niacin-sufficient diet, could recover within weeks. The asylum's diet did not provide sufficient niacin. Cornmeal, molasses, and starches formed the basis of patient meals. Meat, eggs, legumes, and fresh vegetables, all of which contain niacin, were provided in quantities insufficient to meet daily requirements. Patients admitted with mild pellagra deteriorated. Patients who entered the asylum without pellagra developed it after prolonged confinement. The disease became self-perpetuating. Pellagra-induced dementia mimicked or exacerbated psychiatric symptoms, leading to patients being classified as more severely impaired and less suitable for discharge. Patients too ill to work were removed from labor assignments, depriving them of the outdoor activity and sunlight exposure that might have provided marginal nutritional benefit through photosynthesis of vitamin D and incidental consumption of wild plants. The failure chain was complete. Malnutrition-induced disease, disease-induced behavioral deterioration justified continued confinement, confinement perpetuated malnutrition. Tuberculosis operated through a different but equally predictable mechanism. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is transmitted via airborne droplets expelled when an infected individual coughs, sneezes, or speaks. The bacteria can remain suspended in air for hours, particularly in enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces. Transmission risk increases with duration of exposure, proximity to an infectious source, and inadequacy of ventilation. Once inhaled, the bacteria lodge in the lungs and may remain dormant for months or years before activating. Active tuberculosis presents with chronic cough, hemoptysis, coughing up blood, fever, night sweats, and progressive weight loss. If untreated, the disease is often fatal, though some individuals mount an effective immune response and recover spontaneously. The asylum's physical environment was optimized for tuberculosis transmission. Wards designed for 40 patients housed 80 or more. Patients slept in beds placed side by side, often with less than 2 feet of separation. Windows were opened intermittently, depending on weather, but mechanical ventilation systems were inadequate or non-existent in older buildings. Patients with active tuberculosis were not consistently isolated. Biennial reports requested funding for a separate tuberculosis ward, but the request was denied or deferred repeatedly. Infectious patients remained in general population wards, ensuring continuous transmission. The progression of tuberculosis within the asylum population followed a predictable epidemiological curve. patients admitted without tuberculosis were exposed to infectious individuals within days or weeks of arrival. Some fraction of exposed individuals became infected. Some fraction of infected individuals progressed to active disease. Active cases transmitted the bacteria to other susceptible individuals, perpetuating the cycle. Mortality from tuberculosis was high. The 1912 to 1913 biennial report listed tuberculosis as a leading cause of death, accounting for a substantial proportion of the 172 deaths in 1912 and 206 deaths in 1913. The cemetery database documents tuberculosis as the cause of death for numerous patients throughout the 1910s and 1920s. Ada Wynne's death in 1906 was attributed to consumption, the colloquial term for tuberculosis. She was admitted in 1893 and presumably did not have tuberculosis at the time of admission, given that the disease typically kills within 2 to 3 years if untreated. Her infection was almost certainly acquired within the institution. She lived with active tuberculosis for an unknown duration, likely exposing other patients in her ward before her death. The failure chain for tuberculosis involved 3 linked steps. Inadequate ventilation created conditions for transmission. Failure to isolate infectious cases ensured continuous exposure of susceptible individuals. An absence of effective medical treatment meant that infected patients progressed to terminal disease. The only intervention available prior to the development of antibiotics in the 1940s was rest, nutrition, fresh air, and sunlight, summarized under the term sanatorium care. The asylum's overcrowding, inadequate diet, and limited access to outdoor space precluded effective sanatorium care. Patients with tuberculosis deteriorated. The institution's response was not to improve conditions or isolate cases, but to attribute deaths to the inherent severity of the disease and the chronically debilitated state of the patient population. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections followed yet another pathway. These diseases are transmitted via the fecal-oral route, through contaminated water, food, or surfaces. The asylum's sanitation infrastructure was inadequate. The original facility, constructed in the 1850s, relied on wells for drinking water and outdoor privies for waste disposal. Indoor plumbing was added incrementally, but many wards lacked adequate toilet facilities well into the 20th century. Overcrowding worsened sanitation conditions. Patients shared limited bathroom facilities. Hand-washing infrastructure was minimal. Food preparation and dining areas were not consistently separated from patient sleeping quarters. Dysentery, characterized by bloody diarrhea, abdominal cramps, fever, and dehydration, spread rapidly under these conditions. The disease is particularly lethal in individuals who are already malnourished or immunocompromised. Patients weakened by pellagra or tuberculosis were highly susceptible. Mortality from dysentery spiked during summer months when warmer temperatures accelerated bacterial growth in contaminated food and water. The failure chain for dysentery involved inadequate sanitation infrastructure, overcrowding, malnutrition-induced immune compromise, and delayed or absent medical treatment. Patients with dysentery required rehydration, electrolyte replacement, and in severe cases, antibiotics. The asylum had limited capacity to provide these interventions. Patients who developed dysentery were isolated only if their symptoms were severe enough to disrupt ward routine. Mild or moderate cases remained in general population, spreading the infection. Deaths from dysentery were recorded in biennial reports, but attributed to the patient's underlying frailty rather than to the preventable transmission of infectious disease within the institution. The compounding effects of multiple simultaneous conditions illustrate the systemic nature of the failure. A patient admitted with mild psychiatric symptoms and baseline nutritional deficiency would be confined to an overcrowded ward, provided an inadequate diet, and exposed to tuberculosis and dysentery. Over months or years, the patient would develop pellagra, tuberculosis, or gastrointestinal infection, or some combination thereof. The psychiatric symptoms that justified initial commitment would worsen, either due to disease-induced cognitive impairment or as a psychological response to prolonged confinement under inhumane conditions. The patient would become progressively more debilitated, less capable of work, and less suitable for discharge. Eventually, the patient would die. The death would be attributed to tuberculosis, pellagra, or exhaustion. The role of malnutrition, overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, and lack of medical care in precipitating the death would not be acknowledged. The institution's own records provide evidence of this failure chain. The 15-patient sample drawn from admission registers and cross-referenced with the cemetery database reveals consistent patterns. Sarah Bird, a black woman born in 1873, was admitted in 1908 at age 35. She worked as a seamstress within the institution. She could not read or write. She remained confined for 28 years and died on July 15, 1936. Her name does not appear in the Asylum cemetery database, suggesting her burial was not systematically documented. Martha Tillman, a white woman born in 1867, was admitted at age 34 after her husband's death. She remained confined for 23 years and died at age 68 of a liver abscess. Her burial is documented in the cemetery database. Both women spent the majority of their adult lives within the institution. Both died of conditions that were either preventable or treatable. Neither was discharged. Leona Binote, a black woman born in 1887, was admitted in 1928 at age 41. She died 3 years later in 1931 of tuberculosis. She was literate and married. Her length of stay, just 3 years, suggests rapid deterioration after admission. Mose Dent Jr., a black man born in 1868, was admitted in 1907 and died 24 years later in 1931, also of tuberculosis. He was literate and widowed. His prolonged survival with tuberculosis suggests either a slowly progressive form of the disease or repeated cycles of remission and relapse. Ada Daniel, a black woman born in 1883, was admitted in 1916 and died 18 years later, in 1934, of cervical cancer. Her length of stay suggests that her psychiatric condition, whatever it may have been, did not preclude long-term survival, but that she was never considered suitable for discharge. Mary Hamilton, a black woman born in 1870, was admitted in 1903 and died 28 years later, in 1931, of arteriosclerosis. She was widowed and could not read or write. Her 3-decade confinement demonstrates the institution's function as a permanent repository for individuals with no family or financial resources. The racial disparity in mortality is stark and documented. Approximately 75% of analyzed burials are African American, despite black patients constituting 50 to 55% of the total asylum population during the 1920s and 1930s. This disparity cannot be explained by differences in baseline health status or disease susceptibility. It is directly attributable to the segregated, inferior conditions under which black patients were confined. The 1925 to 1927 biennial report explicitly acknowledged that black patients were housed in overcrowded, poorly ventilated wards, denied access to outdoor exercise, and subjected to higher mortality as a direct result. The superintendent's statement that 250 black patient deaths could have been prevented if new facilities had been constructed constitutes documentary evidence that the institution's administrators were aware of the causal relationship between living conditions and mortality, but chose not to implement corrective measures within their existing operational capacity. The failure was not one of knowledge, it was one of priority. The point of no return, the moment at which a patient's trajectory became irreversible, varied by individual circumstance. For patients admitted with acute, treatable conditions, the point of no return was the decision not to discharge them promptly once symptoms stabilized. For patients who entered the asylum in reasonable health, the point of no return was the onset of pellagra, tuberculosis, or another debilitating condition acquired through prolonged exposure to institutional conditions. For patients who were malnourished or immunocompromised upon admission, the point of no return may have been the moment of commitment itself. Once confined, they entered an environment that accelerated rather than arrested their physical decline. The institution did not cause all patient deaths, but it created conditions under which death was far more likely than it would have been outside the institution. This is the definition of systemic failure. The organization designed to prevent harm instead became the primary mechanism through which harm was inflicted. The feedback loop between institutional conditions and patient outcomes was self-reinforcing. Malnutrition caused disease. Disease caused cognitive and behavioral deterioration. Deterioration justified continued confinement. Confinement perpetuated malnutrition. The loop could not be broken without external intervention, either through increased funding, improved conditions, or mass discharge. None of these interventions occurred. The institution continued to admit patients, confine them under inadequate conditions, and bury them in unmarked graves. The cemetery filled not because of individual errors or accidents, but because the system operated according to its structural logic. Patients were removed from society, confined in a resource-starved environment, denied effective medical care, and subjected to infectious diseases that thrived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The outcome was predictable, documented, and preventable. It was not prevented. The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum did not experience a single moment of recognition followed by coordinated stabilization efforts, as would occur in an industrial or nuclear accident. Instead, the institution underwent periodic attempts at reform, prompted by overcrowding crises, disease outbreaks, external criticism, or changes in administrative leadership. These attempts were partial, underfunded, and ultimately ineffective. They did not reverse the structural conditions that produced high mortality. In some cases, reform efforts introduced new forms of harm or redistributed suffering without reducing its total magnitude. The absence of a clear stabilization phase reflects the fundamental nature of the failure. It was not an event requiring emergency response, but a chronic condition embedded in the institution's operational design. The first significant stabilization attempt occurred following the 1892 fire that destroyed two-thirds of the asylum's central building. The fire forced a temporary reduction in patient capacity and prompted legislative discussion of whether to rebuild on the existing site or relocate the institution entirely. The decision to rebuild reflected political and economic considerations rather than clinical ones. The asylum represented a significant capital investment. The land, buildings, and infrastructure could not be easily abandoned. Reconstruction proceeded incrementally over the following decade, with new wings added to accommodate the growing patient population. The rebuilt facility incorporated some improvements in fire safety and ventilation, but did not address the fundamental problem of overcrowding. By the time reconstruction was complete, the patient population had already exceeded the expanded capacity. The fire, which might have served as an opportunity to rethink the institution's design and function, instead became an occasion to replicate the same structural flaws on a slightly larger scale. The second major stabilization attempt was the prolonged effort beginning in the 1910s and extending through the early 1930s, to construct an entirely new facility at a different location. Legislative authorization for the new facility was granted in 1926, but construction was delayed by funding shortages, political disputes, and the onset of the Great Depression. The decision to relocate the asylum to a former state prison farm in Rankin County reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. The prison had been relocated to Parchman Farm in the Mississippi Delta, freeing up a large tract of land 8 miles east of Jackson. The transfer of the asylum to the former prison site made explicit the institution's custodial function. The new facility, eventually named Whitfield, was designed to accommodate 2,600 patients, more than double the original design capacity of the Jackson Asylum, but still insufficient for the actual patient population, which exceeded 2,500 by the time of the move in 1935. The architectural plan for Whitfield reflected evolving psychiatric theories that emphasized segregation by diagnosis and functional capacity. Separate buildings were designated for acute cases, chronic cases, violent cases, senile cases, and patients with tuberculosis. The physical separation was intended to improve management and reduce cross-contamination of disease, but it did not address the underlying resource constraints. The new facility opened with the same inadequate per capita funding, the same low staff-to-patient ratios, and the same dependence on patient labor that had characterized the Jackson Asylum. The relocation itself was a logistical undertaking of significant scale. Over the course of 9 days in March 1935, more than 2,500 patients were transported, by bus, from the Jackson facility to Whitfield. The cost per patient was 15 cents. Patients were moved with minimal personal belongings. Medical records were incomplete or lost in the transfer. The move disrupted whatever fragile continuity of care existed within the old facility. patients who had been confined for decades were uprooted and transported to an unfamiliar environment. Some patients died during or shortly after the move, though precise mortality data for this period are not available. The new facility was celebrated in local media as a symbol of Mississippi's progressive commitment to mental health care. A special section in the Clarion Ledger on February 24, 1935, featured congratulatory advertisements from contractors, suppliers, and local businesses. The Stuart C. Irby Company, which provided lighting and electrical systems, published an advertisement, stating, "Truly this is an institution of which every Mississippian should be proud, and by means of which many will be returned, cured to their homes and families." The optimism reflected in this advertisement bore no relation to the institution's actual outcomes. The vast majority of patients admitted to Whitfield would not be cured or returned to their homes. They would remain confined until death, just as they had at the Jackson facility. The third stabilization attempt involved efforts to address specific disease outbreaks, particularly tuberculosis and pellagra. In the case of tuberculosis, superintendents repeatedly requested funding for a separate tuberculosis ward, where infectious patients could be isolated. These requests were documented in biennial reports throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. The legislature did not appropriate funds for a dedicated tuberculosis building until after the relocation to Whitfield, and even then, the building was not completed immediately. In the interim, tuberculosis patients remained in general population wards, continuing to transmit the disease to susceptible individuals. The absence of isolation capacity meant that any patient admitted to the asylum, regardless of their initial diagnosis, faced substantial risk of tuberculosis exposure. The institution's failure to implement effective tuberculosis control measures was not due to lack of knowledge. By the 1920s, the airborne transmission of tuberculosis was well understood, and public health guidelines for isolation and ventilation were widely disseminated. The failure was one of resource allocation and institutional priority. Tuberculosis control required investment in infrastructure and staffing. The legislature was unwilling to provide that investment. Pellagra presented a different challenge. Unlike tuberculosis, pellagra was not infectious. It could be prevented and reversed through dietary modification alone. The intervention required was well understood and relatively inexpensive: increase the proportion of niacin-rich foods in patient diets. The obstacle was not lack of knowledge but the asylum's food budget. Superintendents acknowledged in biennial reports that patient diets were inadequate and that pellagra was a direct consequence of malnutrition. The 1927 to 1929 report stated, "For some time we have attempted to sterilize those patients who are returned home, and it is to be hoped that in the future, every patient who comes to the institution before they return to their home will be sterilized in order to lessen the mental disorders which will be handed down to future generations, and thereby save the state of the burden of caring for an increased number of mental cases." This passage reveals the institution's priorities. Resources were allocated to eugenic sterilization programs aimed at preventing the reproduction of institutionalized patients, while simultaneously failing to provide the dietary interventions necessary to prevent pellagra deaths. The institution was willing to invest in controlling patients' reproductive capacity, but not in ensuring their survival. The eugenic sterilization law, enacted in Mississippi in 1928, represented a fourth form of stabilization attempt, framed as a preventive measure to reduce future demand for institutional services. The law authorized the sterilization of patients diagnosed with hereditary forms of insanity, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, or epilepsy. Sterilization required a petition to the asylum's board of directors, notification of the patient and legal guardian, and approval by majority vote. The law stipulated that sterilization should serve the best interests of both the patient and society. In practice, the procedure was applied coercively. Patients had no meaningful capacity to consent or refuse. Guardians, if they existed, were often family members who had initiated commitment in the first place and had an interest in ensuring the patient would not reproduce. The eugenic rationale was grounded in hereditarian theories of mental illness that assumed psychiatric conditions were biologically determined and would be transmitted to offspring. These theories were widely accepted within the psychiatric profession during the early 20th century, despite limited empirical evidence. The sterilization program operated parallel to the institution's failure to provide basic medical care. Patients were sterilized to prevent reproduction while dying of preventable diseases. The contradiction was not acknowledged. The implementation of new therapeutic interventions during the 1930s and 1940s introduced secondary crises. Insulin shock therapy, metrazole shock therapy, and electroconvulsive therapy were adopted rapidly, based on preliminary reports of efficacy from other institutions, without rigorous evaluation or standardized protocols. Insulin shock therapy involved injecting patients with large doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemic coma. The procedure was repeated daily for weeks or months. Patients experienced seizures, cardiovascular stress, and in some cases permanent neurological damage or death. Metrazole shock therapy, which used a chemical agent to induce seizures, carried similar risks. Electroconvulsive therapy, introduced in the late 1930s, involved passing electrical current through the patient's brain to induce a generalized seizure. The procedure was initially performed without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, resulting in bone fractures, spinal injuries, and cognitive impairment. These treatments were justified on the grounds that they produced short-term reductions in agitation, hallucinations, or depressive symptoms. Long-term outcomes were not systematically evaluated. Patients could not refuse treatment. Informed consent procedures did not exist. The treatments were applied based on physician judgment, institutional convenience, or as experiments to evaluate efficacy. The adoption of psychosurgery, specifically prefrontal lobotomy in the 1940s, represented the most extreme form of therapeutic intervention. Lobotomy involved severing the neural connections between the prefrontal cortex and other brain regions, either through surgical incision or by inserting a sharp instrument through the eye socket. The procedure was irreversible. It often produced profound personality changes, cognitive impairment, and loss of initiative. Proponents argued that lobotomy reduced violent or agitated behavior and made patients more manageable. Critics, even at the time, questioned whether rendering patients docile through brain damage constituted legitimate therapy. Documentary evidence regarding the use of lobotomy at the Mississippi State Hospital is limited. The museum curator at Whitfield, Donna Brown, stated in an interview that lobotomies were never performed at the Mississippi facility, but this claim is difficult to verify given the incomplete nature of medical records. Lobotomies were performed at other southern state hospitals during this period, and Mississippi's institution was not significantly different in its adoption of controversial treatments. Whether or not lobotomies were performed, the institution's willingness to adopt insulin shock, metrazole shock, and electroconvulsive therapy without rigorous safeguards demonstrates a pattern in which experimental or harmful interventions were applied to a captive population unable to resist. The post-relocation period at Whitfield saw continued overcrowding and deteriorating conditions. By 1950, the patient population had grown to 4,083, far exceeding the facility's design capacity of 2,600. The per capita allocation of space was 138 square feet per patient. Staffing remained inadequate. There were no psychiatric social workers, one untrained recreational therapist, and only 15 registered nurses for a population exceeding 4,000. By 1958, the patient population had reached 4,500. Weekend coverage consisted of one physician and one nurse for the entire facility. By 1971, the population had grown to 5,200, prompting renewed allegations of abuse and neglect. The investigative journalism of Harding Carter in 1949 to 1950 documented conditions at Whitfield that mirrored those of the Jackson Asylum: overcrowding, malnutrition, inadequate medical care, routine use of mechanical restraints, and physical punishment of patients. Carter's reporting prompted a legislative investigation, but the investigation resulted in minimal reforms. Abusive attendants were dismissed, but the underlying structural conditions that enabled abuse were not addressed. The introduction of antipsychotic medications in the 1950s, particularly chlorpromazine, represented the first pharmacological intervention with demonstrated efficacy in reducing psychotic symptoms. Antipsychotics allowed some patients to be discharged who would previously have been considered too symptomatic to live outside the institution. The medications also reduced the need for mechanical restraints and isolation. However, antipsychotics carried significant side effects, including sedation, extrapyramidal symptoms, and in long-term use, tardive dyskinesia, a movement disorder characterized by involuntary facial and limb movements. The medications were often administered in high doses without careful titration or monitoring. Patients were not informed of potential side effects. The introduction of antipsychotics did not fundamentally alter the custodial nature of the institution. It made patients easier to manage, but did not address the lack of therapeutic programming, the absence of discharge planning, or the continued dependence on prolonged institutionalization. The deinstitutionalization movement, which began in the 1960s and accelerated in the 1970s and 1980s, led to a gradual reduction in the patient population at Whitfield. The movement was driven by multiple factors: the availability of antipsychotic medications that allowed patients to be managed in community settings, growing awareness of the dehumanizing conditions within state hospitals, legal challenges asserting patients' rights to treatment in the least restrictive environment, and fiscal pressure to reduce the cost of institutional care. By the 1990s, the patient population at Whitfield had declined to fewer than 1,000. By the 2000s, it had declined further. As of 2018, the facility housed approximately 600 patients, most of whom were short-term admissions lasting weeks or months rather than years. The decline in population did not represent a triumph of therapeutic intervention. It represented a shift in the locus of neglect. Patients who would previously have been confined in state hospitals were instead homeless, incarcerated, or inadequately supported in community settings. The asylum ceased to function as a warehouse for the marginalized, not because the marginalized ceased to exist, but because society developed alternative mechanisms for managing them. The cemetery remained throughout these transitions. When the asylum relocated to Whitfield in 1935, the graves were not moved. The bodies remained on the original campus, which was sold and eventually became the site of the University of Mississippi Medical Center. The cemetery was not marked, memorialized, or protected. It was forgotten. Construction projects in the 1990s and 2010s rediscovered the graves, first 44 in 1992, then 66 in 2012. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 2010s estimated that more than 7,000 individuals are buried in the cemetery, far more than had been documented in asylum records. The discrepancy reflects the incomplete nature of record-keeping, particularly prior to 1912, when Mississippi did not issue death certificates. The bodies represent the cumulative mortality of 80 years of institutional operation. They are the physical manifestation of systemic failure. Stabilization was never achieved because the institution was not designed to stabilize. It was designed to remove, confine, and ultimately bury. The forensic investigation of the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum began not through deliberate inquiry, but through accidental discovery. In 1992, construction workers preparing a site for road improvements on the University of Mississippi Medical Center campus unearthed 44 wooden coffins containing human remains. The discovery prompted a limited archaeological excavation and reinterment of the remains in 1994. The graves were recognized as belonging to former asylum patients, but no comprehensive study was initiated. The site was documented, the remains were reburied, and construction proceeded. Nearly 2 decades later, in November 2012, a second construction project uncovered an additional 66 graves. This discovery could not be dismissed as isolated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys commissioned in response to the 2012 find revealed anomalies consistent with thousands of additional burials across a 26-acre area. The estimated count rose from hundreds to over 7,000, making the Asylum Cemetery one of the largest institutional burial grounds in the United States. The physical evidence, preserved in pine coffins buried in sandy soil, provided material confirmation of what archival records had suggested, but not fully documented, that the asylum had functioned as a site of mass mortality over its 80-year operational history. The coffins themselves constitute primary forensic evidence. The 66 coffins excavated in 2012 were constructed of pine, a locally available, inexpensive wood. The coffins were simple rectangular boxes with peaked or flat lids, consistent with 19th and early 20th century burial practices for indigent populations. Dendrochronological analysis, which examines tree ring patterns in the wood, dated the coffins to the period between 1926 and 1931. This date range aligns with the peak of the pellagra epidemic and the period of maximum overcrowding immediately preceding the asylum's relocation. The coffins were arranged in rows, oriented east-west, with bodies positioned supine, hands placed across the chest or at the sides. The burials followed Christian mortuary conventions, suggesting that despite the absence of grave markers, some degree of ritual observance was maintained. The uniformity of coffin construction and burial orientation indicates that interments were conducted systematically, likely by asylum staff or patient laborers, rather than haphazardly. The coffins bore no external markings, nameplates, or identification. The anonymity was structural, not incidental. The human remains provide direct evidence of the conditions under which patients lived and died. Bioarchaeological analysis conducted by Molly Zuckerman and her team at Mississippi State University has focused on identifying markers of disease, malnutrition, and physical trauma inscribed in the skeletal material. Pellagra, while primarily a soft tissue disease, can leave skeletal indicators. Chronic malnutrition affects bone density and growth patterns. Individuals who experienced prolonged nutritional deficiency during childhood or adolescence exhibit stunted growth, thinner cortical bone, and evidence of growth arrest lines, horizontal bands visible in long bones that form when growth temporarily ceases due to illness or starvation. Adults who experienced chronic malnutrition exhibit reduced bone mineral density, increasing susceptibility to fractures. Preliminary findings from the Asylum Hill skeletal sample indicate that a significant proportion of individuals exhibited markers consistent with chronic malnutrition. These findings corroborate documentary evidence from biennial reports acknowledging inadequate diets and endemic pellagra. Tuberculosis, unlike pellagra, leaves distinctive skeletal markers in a subset of cases. Pulmonary tuberculosis, the most common form, primarily affects soft tissue and does not directly impact bone. However, when the disease spreads beyond the lungs, it can cause skeletal tuberculosis, which most commonly affects the spine, producing a condition known as Pott's disease. Pott's disease results in destruction of vertebral bodies, collapse of the spinal column, and formation of angular kyphosis, a sharp forward curvature of the spine. Skeletal tuberculosis can also affect ribs, producing lytic lesions, and can affect joints, particularly the hip and knee. Examination of the Asylum Hill skeletal remains has identified several individuals with lesions consistent with skeletal tuberculosis. The presence of these lesions confirms that tuberculosis was not only a documented cause of death in asylum records but was sufficiently advanced in some individuals to produce bone pathology. The skeletal evidence validates the archival documentation and demonstrates that tuberculosis was endemic within the institution. Trauma markers provide evidence of physical abuse, accidents, or the use of mechanical restraints. Healed fractures indicate injuries sustained during life with sufficient survival time for bone remodeling to occur. Unhealed fractures indicate injuries sustained at or near the time of death. Perimortem trauma, injuries occurring at the time of death, can be distinguished from post-mortem damage by the presence or absence of healing, and by fracture patterns. Analysis of the Asylum Hill remains has identified individuals with healed rib fractures, healed long bone fractures, and evidence of repetitive stress injuries consistent with prolonged manual labor. Rib fractures are common in individuals subjected to physical violence or in individuals who experience seizures without protective padding. The presence of multiple healed rib fractures in a single individual suggests repeated episodes of trauma. Long bone fractures in institutionalized populations may result from falls, altercations, or the application of physical restraints with excessive force. Repetitive stress injuries, such as osteoarthritis in weight-bearing joints or enthesopathies at muscle attachment sites, indicate prolonged physical labor under conditions that exceed normal biomechanical loading. The demographic composition of the cemetery population provides critical evidence of differential mortality. Preliminary analysis indicates that approximately 75% of the burials are African American, despite Black patients constituting roughly 50 to 55% of the asylum population during the 1920s and 1930s. This disparity cannot be attributed to differences in admission rates alone. It reflects differential mortality rates driven by the segregated, inferior conditions under which Black patients were confined. The skeletal evidence corroborates documentary evidence from biennial reports that explicitly acknowledged overcrowding, poor ventilation, and lack of outdoor access in wards housing Black patients. The 1925 to 1927 report statement that 250 Black patient deaths could have been prevented if facilities had been improved is validated by the physical evidence of disproportionate Black representation in the cemetery. The cemetery composition is not a neutral demographic fact. It is material evidence of structural racism resulting in excess mortality. The absence of grave markers is itself forensic evidence. Markers were not removed or destroyed, they were never installed. The decision not to mark graves reflects institutional priorities. Wooden or stone markers were standard in 19th and early 20th century cemeteries, even for indigent burials. The cost of markers was modest. The choice not to install them reflects a judgment that the individuals buried did not warrant permanent identification. The asylum maintained records of patient deaths, at least in aggregate form, suggesting that individual identities were known at the time of burial. The failure to transfer those identities to physical markers ensured that once buried, patients could not be recovered or memorialized by surviving family members. The unmarked cemetery functioned as an extension of the institutional erasure that had characterized patients' lives. They were removed from society, confined in an institution, rendered administratively invisible, and buried without names. The rediscovery of the cemetery in the 21st century has prompted ethical and legal questions regarding the disposition of the remains. The University of Mississippi Medical Center, which owns the land, initially framed the issue as a conflict between institutional expansion and historic preservation. The medical center requires additional space for clinical facilities, research buildings, and parking. The cemetery occupies 26 acres of developable land in a constrained urban campus. The initial response, reflected in internal documents and public statements from 2012 to 2017, was to seek legal authorization to exhume the remains, conduct limited study, and re-enter them in a reduced footprint, freeing the majority of the land for development. Mississippi law, as codified in 1973, granted the medical center authority to disinter remains from what the statute termed a potter's field, defined as land abandoned for more than a year. The law required only that the medical center publish notice of intent to disinter in a local newspaper for 3 consecutive weeks. This procedural requirement, designed for small-scale cemetery relocations, was inadequate for a burial ground containing thousands of individuals whose descendants had never been systematically notified of the cemetery's existence. In 2017, the estimated body count rose above 7,000, attracting national media attention. Reporting by Jerry Mitchell in the Clarion Ledger, followed by coverage in the New York Times, CNN, and other outlets, reframed the issue from a local land use question to a national story about institutional abuse, racial injustice, and the ethics of handling human remains from marginalized populations. The media attention prompted the formation of the Asylum Hill Research Consortium, a multidisciplinary group of archaeologists, bioarchaeologists, historians, ethicists, legal scholars, and descendant community representatives. The consortium's stated objectives are to determine the ethical and legal framework for managing the remains, to maximize the scientific and educational value of the site, and to memorialize the individuals buried there. The consortium has met twice, in May 2017 and March 2018, and has yet to reach consensus on key questions: whether the remains should be exhumed, whether exhumation constitutes desecration or preservation, whether descendants have a right to veto exhumation, and whether the medical center's institutional need for land justifies disturbance of the graves. Ralph Didlake, director of the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, has articulated the institution's position. The medical center acknowledges moral responsibility for the cemetery and commits to respectful management of the remains. The institution proposes a phased approach, Hire a dedicated bioarchaeologist for the project. Conduct systematic exhumation of approximately 4,000 graves. Perform bioarchaeological analysis to document health conditions and causes of death. Construct a permanent research and memorial facility to house the remains, and create a public educational program to ensure the patient's stories are not forgotten. The estimated cost of full excavation is $2.1 million, at approximately $4,500 per burial. The medical center plans to fund initial exhumation through state appropriations and seek private donations for the research facility. The Mississippi legislature passed Senate Bill 2895 in the 2018 session, revising the legal framework to require more extensive consultation with descendant communities and to provide explicit authorization for the medical center to proceed with exhumation under defined conditions. The bill represents a legislative acknowledgement that the 1973 statute was inadequate for a burial ground of this scale and historical significance. Descendant community responses have been mixed. Some descendants, such as Karen Clark, great-great-great-granddaughter of Isham Ernest, and Hazel McCarty, great-niece of Ada Wynne, support exhumation and scientific study. They view the project as an opportunity to recover stories that were systematically erased and to memorialize individuals who died in obscurity. Other descendants and advocacy groups have expressed concern that exhumation, even if conducted with respectful intent, constitutes a second violation. The patients did not consent to institutionalization, did not consent to the conditions under which they were confined, and did not consent to burial in an unmarked grave. Exhuming them for scientific study, regardless of the knowledge gained, imposes another non-consensual use of their bodies. This ethical position holds that the most respectful course of action is to leave the remains undisturbed, to protect the cemetery as a memorial site, and to expand the medical center in a different direction. The tension between these positions reflects broader debates in bioarchaeology and museum studies regarding the treatment of human remains from historically oppressed populations. The forensic lessons emerging from the Asylum Hill case extend beyond the specific circumstances of the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum. The cemetery is material evidence of how institutions designed to provide care can become engines of harm when structural conditions. Chronic underfunding, overcrowding, racial segregation, dependence on captive labor, weak oversight create predictable pathways toward failure. The lessons are not specific to psychiatric asylums or to the early 20th century. They apply to any closed institution managing vulnerable populations: prisons, nursing homes, immigration detention centers, residential schools for indigenous children. The mechanisms are consistent. Populations are removed from public view, confined under conditions justified as necessary for management or security, subjected to resource constraints that prioritize efficiency over dignity. And when they suffer or die, their suffering is attributed to their inherent pathology rather than to institutional failure. The first systemic lesson is that design assumptions must be continuously validated against operational reality. The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum was designed on the premise that confinement, structure, and labor would be therapeutic. This premise was never rigorously tested. The institution did not systematically track patient outcomes, did not compare recovery rates to those of patients treated in alternative settings, and did not adjust practices based on evidence of effectiveness. The assumption that the institution was therapeutic persisted despite mounting evidence that patients confined for extended periods deteriorated rather than improved. The lesson is that institutions must implement feedback mechanisms that allow design assumptions to be challenged and revised when they are contradicted by operational data. The second lesson is that segregation, whether by race, diagnosis, or functional capacity, creates conditions for unequal treatment and excess mortality in marginalized subgroups. The Mississippi Asylum's racial segregation was legally mandated and culturally normalized. It was also lethal. Black patients were confined in inferior facilities, denied access to therapeutic interventions, and died at higher rates. The biennial reports documented this disparity, but did not frame it as an ethical failure requiring immediate corrective action. Instead, it was presented as an unfortunate consequence of resource constraints that would be addressed in the future. The lesson is that segregation, even when justified by logistical or administrative rationales, must be presumed to produce unequal outcomes and must be subject to rigorous monitoring and accountability. The third lesson is that dependence on captive labor creates perverse incentives that prioritize institutional convenience over patient welfare. The asylum required patient labor to sustain its operations. Patients who worked were essential, but their labor did not translate into improved conditions, accelerated discharge, or any form of compensation. The institution had a financial interest in retaining capable workers, creating a structural disincentive to discharge. The lesson is that institutions managing vulnerable populations must not depend on the labor of those populations for operational sustainability. Dependence creates exploitation and ensures that the interests of the institution will override the interests of the individuals confined within it. The fourth lesson is that high mortality rates, if normalized, cease to function as indicators of systemic failure. The asylum superintendents reported patient deaths in biennial reports, often with minimal explanation or analysis. Mortality was framed as an expected outcome, given the chronic nature of patients' conditions. Comparisons to external benchmarks were rare. When deaths spiked during epidemics, they were attributed to factors beyond institutional control. The normalization of mortality eliminated internal pressure to investigate root causes or implement preventive measures. The lesson is that institutions must establish clear mortality benchmarks, investigate deviations from those benchmarks, and treat preventable deaths as failures requiring corrective action rather than as inevitable consequences of patient pathology. The fifth lesson is that external oversight is essential and must be independent, adequately resourced, and empowered to enforce corrective action. The Mississippi Asylum operated under minimal oversight. The Board of Trustees reviewed financial reports, but did not conduct systematic evaluations of clinical practices or patient outcomes. State inspections were infrequent and superficial. Media coverage was limited and typically favorable. When abuses were reported, investigations were conducted by legislative committees with limited expertise and a vested interest in avoiding scandal. The absence of rigorous external oversight allowed harmful practices to persist for decades. The lesson is that institutions managing vulnerable populations must be subject to regular, independent inspection by entities with clinical and ethical expertise, and those entities must have authority to mandate reforms and impose consequences for failures to comply. The sixth lesson is that record-keeping systems must be designed to preserve individual narratives, not just aggregate statistics. The asylum's admission registers recorded basic demographic data and administrative transactions, but did not track treatment, behavioral observations, or clinical progress. The result is an archive that documents the existence of thousands of individuals, but provides almost no information about their experiences, symptoms, or trajectories. The absence of records ensures that the patients remain anonymous and that their stories cannot be told. The lesson is that institutions must implement record-keeping systems that preserve sufficient detail to allow retrospective analysis of individual cases and to support accountability when harm occurs. The seventh lesson is that procedural barriers to discharge, even when justified by concerns for patient safety or public protection, can transform temporary confinement into indefinite detention. The asylum's discharge procedures required formal petitions, medical certification, and family or county willingness to assume custody. For chronic patients, particularly those without family or financial resources, these barriers were insurmountable. The lesson is that institutions must establish clear, time-limited criteria for discharge, must provide patients with procedural rights to challenge continued confinement, and must not be permitted to indefinitely detain individuals simply because they have nowhere else to go. The cemetery is the physical manifestation of these systemic failures. It is not an accident or an anomaly. It is the logical outcome of a system that removed individuals from society, confined them under conditions that made death predictable, and buried them without names. The graves do not represent individual errors or moments of crisis. They represent 80 years of continuous operation according to structural logic that prioritize social control and fiscal efficiency over human dignity and life. The forensic evidence confirms what the archival evidence suggested. The Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum functioned exactly as its design assumptions dictated. The cemetery grew because the system worked.